Hi, this is Bill with the Georgia Appalachian Trail Club, and today we're going to talk about trail maintenance. But I want to start with a little bit of information about the ATC and the club. The Appalachian Trail Conservancy is the overseeing organization for all the 31 trail maintaining clubs up and down the 2,100 plus miles of the Appalachian Trail. In Georgia, we have about 78 miles of trail, the Appalachian Trail, and we have another 40 or so miles of side trails we maintain. It's all done by volunteers, and we're going to show what those volunteers do today. The way we're organized in the club is that we have a trail supervisor, and then the trail itself is divided into sections, and those sections are grouped into districts. So we have a district leader for a section of maybe 12 miles of the trail, and each of those 12 miles has an individual maintainer volunteer, sometimes a pair of volunteers, who are responsible for that work. Okay, we're back and we're going to talk about personal protective equipment. Before we start any trail work, we want to make sure that we're protected in a number of ways. So we wear things like a hard hat, safety glasses, gloves for our hands, long pants, and sturdy shoes. Those are all important when we're working on the trail because many of the tools we use have sharp edges and we're dealing with rocks and uneven terrain. Okay, after we talked about the personal protective equipment, we need to talk about situational awareness on the trail. When we're working, we need to be aware of things like dangerous limbs and trees overhead as we're working. We need to make sure we're looking at stumbling areas and step overs and rocks and things and make sure we're careful about how we walk and where we are. We should be aware of any particular plants that are dangerous, such as poison ivy, and make sure we don't walk into that unaware. And also any particular wildlife that may be active in the time of year we're working. All of these things are important. In addition, we need to know where the closest medical facility is to the work location. We need to know who is first aid trained amongst the crew, and we need to have first aid kits available. Okay, we've talked a little bit about the work trip experience and personal protective equipment and safety in the situation. Let's talk about the tools themselves. One of the key things we have to be careful about is how we use our tools, where other people are when we're using our tools, and make sure no one gets injured. One of the key things we talk about is what we call the circle of death. With any tool, you should be able to work clear of anyone else within this range so that tools don't hit each other or other people aren't involved. This is a very good way to make sure that where you're working is safe and not dangerous for you or others for that. Another important thing about tools is how you carry them when we're going in and out of the work site. We want to make sure that we carry them down and to the side with a sharp edge away from us. Usually on the downhill side of the trail, should you stumble or fall, the tool will go down the hill and not come up the hill and possibly fall back on you again. Lastly, I want to talk about when we're taking a break and not using the tools, we want to be able to put the tool away safely. So we want to take that tool and lay it uphill with the sharp end away from the trail so that it has no chance of falling on or being stepped on by a worker. Hi, we're back and we're talking about tools themselves right now. We have a number of tools we use to prune, to weed, and to dig on the trail. These are simple hand tools that we typically use. We have a razor saw here, very sharp, but very effective in cutting small blowdowns in small trees. And then different types of pruners for doing the pruning along the trail to make sure the trail is clear and open to the hikers. This next tool is one of our heaviest digging tools. This is a pickmatic. It has a sharp end for leveraging rocks and digging into hard ground and a nice digging end here. Again, it's a heavy tool. You should never have to raise this above your head. Most of the work, the weight of the tool can do when you're doing this work. So it's very good, but heavy work tool. This one looks very similar. This is a Pulaski. You can see the difference in the tool. This has a digging end and a lever end. This one has two cutting ends. We use this for heavy root work and cutting and try not to do a lot of digging with it where we would dull the blades. This is a rogue hoe. It has nice sharpened tines on one end and a sharpened edge on the other. It's for medium digging and grading and it's a great tool to do your initial shaping of the trail. Again, the tool is weighted and you can let the tool do a lot of the work so you don't have to sling and wear yourself out trying to do that on the trail. The next tool for the lighter work would be the McLeod. It also has tines and a sharp digging edge and is used for shaping, digging, and leveling the trail. Again, lighter work than the other tools you've seen, but very effective and one of my favorite tools. And this one is a fire rake. It has sharp edges here, Sharp edges on the bottom is great for grading, leveling, and smoothing. It can also be used sideways to cut roots and things when you're working on the trail. And then lastly, I have a sling blade. Sharp edges, again, have to be careful with those, and it's used for weeding along the edges of the trail when you're doing trail work. Okay, now we're going to talk about some basic activities that most maintainers take when they maintain their section of trail. Right now I'm going to talk about something called the berm and something called the slough. So let me get down here where I can show you more what I'm talking about. This is the treadway of the trail. We try to make sure this is level and has an outslope of about 5 degrees. Then we have the back slope over here, usually about 45 degrees before it goes uphill. And then we have an outslope over here to make sure that water and trash goes downhill when we have it. So all these things have to be considered when you're maintaining the trail. What happens over time is from traffic and from water, trash builds up on the edge over here, and we call this the berm along here, and leaves and sticks and dirt pile up and make a trough in the trail, right? Then on the back side, trash washes downhill and begins to fill in the nice cuts we've made here in the back. We like those to be sharp and crisp. It gives hikers kind of a visual cue where to be on the trail, and it also makes sure that trash washes across the trail and downhill. So we're going to clean both sides of the trail up. Okay, for working on the berm, I'm going to use the rogue hoe to both shape and cut the berm off. So what I want to do here is rake all of the slough off the edge of the trail as I go across here, and make sure I have a smooth edge from the center of the trail to the edge. Needs to be flat or slightly downhill. So I want to always go to the low point and work my way out to make sure I have a path for the water and the trash to wash off the trail. So that's a brief demonstration of the berm side of the trail. When we go on the back side, again, we have the back slope. We want this to be 45 degrees, and clearly this is filled up with trash. So back here we want to work up the hill and make a nice cut. I have some roots here I'm going to have to cut out with a Pulaski probably. Big rock. So I'm going to keep working this, but the idea here is to clean out this back edge with a nice 45-degree slope, again across our 5% grade here, and a nice clean drop off where the berm was. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit now about the kinds of structures we use on the trail, mainly to control water. The biggest erosion problem we have is driven by the weather. And when water washes down off the side hills and onto the trail, we want to make sure it goes across the trail and not down the trail. If it goes down the trail, it creates troughs and gullies. We'd rather have it go across the trail where it does less damage. And we accomplish this in a number of different ways. We use water bars, which are usually earthen structures. We've stopped using rocks and logs to make those, but they go diagonally across the trail, usually with a slight dip to them, to capture the water and take it off the trail. We also use dips, which are bigger cuts in the trail, usually half-moon type cuts into the trail that slope from the back slope down to the down slope. And those are usually in lower spots along the trail where the trail's flat. We need to try and get some of that water off the trail. But the best thing we use today are rolling grade dips, like the one I'm standing in now. When we design the trail, we try to look at the terrain and make sure we have the trail go up and down over time, not just one big flat water slide for the water to create gullies and things. So I'm at the low spot right now, which is an area we want to clean trash out of. And you can see looking up the trail, it goes uphill this way and uphill this way with that. So once we see a rolling grade like this and we see where the trash collects or where sand is washed to from the water, that's where we want to do some more berm work and clear out the trail down below. This is an example of how the trail goes from a high spot down to the bottom and then back up to a low spot, a rolling grade dip. Okay, I'm down here at the bottom of this rolling grade dip, and you can tell because see how the sand is collected right here on the trail from water being washed from the two sides. So when we're looking at this, what we really want to do is just scrape this like we did before with the berm work to make sure that the water, when it gets to this low point on the trail, is going to do a good job of coming off the trail. You typically want to clear a little bit broader area, but for demonstration purposes, we just want to make the point that you clear the bottom of the low point on a rolling grade dip. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit more about water on the trail and water diversion structures. Earlier we showed you a rolling grade dip, which is a very long way to manage an area and get water off the trail using the actual structure of the trail itself. In some cases, though, we have to have structures or forms to force water off the trail. We'll call those a small dip or drain. Sometimes we call them a water bar, depending on what we're doing. With water bars, our preference these days is to use dirt whenever we can and do an earthen water bar. And we try to integrate that with the trail in a way that it's ramped up for the hiker coming into it through the small, narrow dip, not real narrow, but narrow, and then a grade out of it so the hiker has a smooth transition across that, but we still bring water across the trail. If we can't use just the dirt to make our water bars, we can use rocks, but they need to be large rocks, like 150-pound rocks that will stay in the ground and do the job they're supposed to do, not small rocks that can be moved by hiker traffic and weather coming across. Like some of these we see here are fairly small rocks and probably wouldn't do the job in the long run. We occasionally also use timber to do that, but the only real log that lasts out here in the conditions we have is the locust tree. It's a very durable wood, it's easy to strip the bark, and they last for years in the ground. So we'll use locust trees for check steps and for water bars. Now I mentioned check steps, and check steps are just wood steps that are across the trail perpendicular to the path, and they're used to capture debris and dirt over time. So you might see a series of wooden structures across the trail. They will fill up with dirt and debris over time and level the trail and provide a better foundation rather than a sloped area. So they're not really steps, they're further apart, and they're used to replenish a trail that's eroded significantly. So in this case here we have a water bar that was done with rocks, and as we talked earlier, they're probably not large enough or heavy enough rocks. And this particular one has completely filled up with dirt. There's no longer much of a dip here, and we want to take this out, clean it, and clean the trough to make sure that the water is captured coming down the hill and fully leaves the trail when it goes across. So we're going to do some work and come back and talk about that. starts it. Okay, so we've taken that dip, which wasn't particularly strongly maintained, and turned it back into a useful water feature. We want to come all the way across the trail when we do this because we want to capture water coming down the full width of the trail. We want the low point to be in the center of this so the water runs out here and doesn't actually run up against our structure, whatever it may be, rocks or wood or dirt here, right? We want it nice and wide to handle the appropriate amount of water in difficult rains, and we want it clear well down the hill to make sure the water has a place to go and we're not going to end up with little dams along the way. So clearing it out completely is a good idea, and that's what we do with the water bar. Okay, I wanted to talk about cut-throughs, where this is a switchback that probably goes down about 50 feet each way, but people have made this social cut-through across the corner of the switchback. It's a simple task to walk around that corner, but for some reason we have hikers and users that like to make these cuts. They're very bad for the trail because they create water troughs, and this is what will wash not only through the social trail, but down and across the regular hiking trail. So we want to do everything we can to try to prevent hikers from coming through here. So I'm going to take a few minutes to trash this up. Okay? So what we want to do is look for any rocks and sticks and brush that we can and begin to cover this. Not only with the sticks and things, but it helps to come back and sprinkle leaves and trash and drag brushy plants in here as well. But these sticks will give you a foundation to hold whatever you put in to try and do the trashing of the trail. So I'll continue this for a little while. Okay, I want to talk about some of the other activities trail maintainers have on the trail. One of those is taking care of campsites, and we have a number of types of campsites, as you've probably experienced on the trail yourself. We have designated campsites at our shelter locations. We have other designated campsites along the trail that the club has built intentionally to try to draw hikers to those locations. And then we have pop-up campsites that just happen because a hiker likes that area or wants to camp where he gets tired at the end of the day. We have names for them. We have conforming tent sites, which go by certain criteria of their size and their capacity and their facilities. We have non-conforming by exception, which means that they're close to being what we would like them to be, and there may be some exception, but we've decided as a club to support that and sustain it as a campsite. And then we have non-conforming tent sites, which are those that are too close to the trail or too close to water or too set up in a way that's causing erosion or degradation of the environment. So we have to look at all those different types of tent sites, and as maintainers we have all those in our sections to maintain, and there's certain activities we have to go through to take care of them. Often associated with almost every overnight site is some place for toileting, and this is a big problem on the trail. People are usually not educated about proper methods, and then as maintainers we have to sometimes deal with the outcomes of that. So what we really encourage people to do is use the appropriate methods of disposing of solid waste, and that includes trowels and toilet paper, right? We have to learn how to dig cat holes, which are usually about 6 inches deep, about 4 to 6 inches wide. Using a trowel to dig the hole. You don't use a trowel to handle any solid waste. Then once you've made your deposit, want to make sure that any toilet paper you use associated with that goes into the hole, that we refill the dirt and cover with local trash, debris from the trail back over that hole. Usually we'll stick a stick in it too to warn future users that that particular location has been used. But proper leave no trace practices using a trowel is the right way to do that. At least 200 feet from the campsite. You can see this trail here that probably wanders off in the woods. It's a good example. 200 feet away, cat hole, bury your toilet paper, cover it up. Okay, now I want to talk about the campsite itself. There's a number of things a maintainer wants to do when he comes across a tent site in his area. First, we want to just survey the area and kind of see what kind of impact has been made by hikers and how much this site is used. We want to stroll the perimeter of the campsite. We want to look behind trees and back in the bushes for any trash. Make sure all of that is picked up and cleaned. We may even want to trash up the edge of the tent site to try to compact the size of it. Usually 1 or 2 tents is all we want to see at a dispersed site like this. And then we want to come to the fire pit. The number one place wildlife goes looking for food is fire pits. And it's because people leave trash and food items in the fire pits. And so one of the things the maintainer wants to do is take that out of the pit. I carry trash bags and rubber gloves to help with that as a maintainer. You may want to do the same thing. I can even use the trash bag to scoop up ashes and haul them off to reduce the size of the pit. This particular fire pit is way too large for a small tent site. The rocks are way too big. We typically want one layer, about an 18-inch fire pit made up of smaller rocks, not these large 100-pound rocks. So with some help, I would disperse these rocks and make this a much smaller pit. The other thing is we don't want to burn large wood like this because it turns out to be just charred chunks that create ash all around the fire pit. We use a saying in the ridge running about down, dry, dinky, and distant. You want dead wood that's fairly small, smaller than your wrist, something you can break with your hands. You want to gather it away from the tent site so you don't totally strip by the tent site with the wood, and you want to make sure it's dry so it burns well. You also don't want to leave fuel by the fire like this. Each camper should be able to collect the small amount they need for this fire they're going to have, and not encourage people to build large fires with large piles of dry wood by the fire pit. So what we want to do here, we'll take some time to de-trash this, to carry off the logs and clean it up as best we can. And on a future visit, we'll probably shrink the size of this to a single layer of rocks with probably an 18-inch diameter would be more appropriate for this size tent site. Okay, so now I'm going to use a sling blade and I'm going to weed along the side of the trail. I'm going to do a light weed on the downhill side of the trail and a little bit deeper weeding on the uphill side. That's to encourage the hikers to stay to the uphill side of the trail. What happens over time is hikers tend to walk along the edge and towards the edge, and it degrades the trail, and the trail actually moves down the hill. So when we do trail work, both working on the slough, which I talked about earlier, and doing the pruning, we want to do that a little bit heavier on the uphill side and lighter on the downhill side to encourage hikers to stay in that direction. So now let me do this little bit of weeding. And that's all it takes. If I don't fall down. Okay, now I'm going to talk about pruning. A lot of times on the trail we'll see small branches and limbs like this hanging out over the trail. And again, we want to clear this enough for a hiker to walk through. When you prune, there's a couple of things to keep in mind. We use small pruners, we have large pruners as well, loppers, and we have hand pruners. All these will work just fine to do most of this work. When we prune, we want to make sure we prune enough that we don't have to come back in 6 months and do it again. So I always talk about a 2-year or a 3-year prune. You want to reach back far enough to prune these branches that they're not going to grow back in one season. So try to shoot for a couple of seasons of growth and feel free to cut them back significantly to make sure they stay off the trail. Just for demonstration purposes, I want to talk a little bit about pruning. Even though I'm going to prune back further, when you prune, you want to prune near a branch on the tree, so you end up with a clean cut and it still can look like a shrub and it'll grow back correctly. You don't want to cut it off with a big bare branch because someone can get poked or stuck by that and it's not really going to grow back naturally. So try to come back to some point on the tree that makes sense when you do your pruning. You may want to prune in sections when you prune to take something down. Take pieces off and work your way down. I'm going to use the loppers as this gets bigger for that. And work your way back. Look for a growth spurt on it. And make sure it's well off the trail for that. All of your brush, if you have it, you want to throw downhill where it can degrade there. Again, cut back. I'm going to cut back a little further here. Go ahead and move that. I'm going to cut back further on these because, again, we don't want these to grow back anytime soon, and we don't want to leave sharp or spiky objects for hikers to walk into. So other than the hand printers and the loppers, sometimes we have to use a razor saw. Again, these are very sharp, so be careful when using them. And they work best on the pull rather than the push like a normal saw. So think about the pull, very sharp blades. When you have a limb that you want to cut, there's some weight on that. So the best way to start this is always start with a small undercut on the limb. And this way the bark won't catch, it won't be a hinge when you cut the rest of the branch off. Then you can come to the top of the branch and make those cuts, and it will come cleanly off the tree. Okay, so you've heard a lot today about maintaining the Appalachian Trail. Here in Georgia, we have a club of some 750 people with over 200 maintainers, so there's always an opportunity for those of you who are interested. We hope this video piques your interest and you'll think about joining the club and becoming a maintainer. Today we covered things like safety equipment, tool safety, how to work on dips, how to prune, how to do weeds. We talked about graded trail dips. We talked about water bars, and we even talked about trashing up social trails and cleaning up campsites. All these things are activities you can do if you're a trail maintainer, and we'll hope you come and join us. In addition to our regular trail maintainers in Georgia, we have some crews that do rock work, sawyer work, and structure work on things like shelters and privies. So there's other opportunities as well. And occasionally we bring in elite crews from around the country to help us with particularly difficult or sophisticated work on the trail. It's an exciting thing to do. We hope you'll join us, and thanks for watching. And don't forget to check out our website, georgia-atclub.org, and see what other things our club is up to.